This show was brought to you by SAS. Hello everyone, welcome to the Defense Line's Hungary's first podcast on the control functions in banking, insurance and corporate sectors. My name is András Bácsfalvi and I'm your host for the show that brings you real value and hands-on takeaways from the field of compliance, anti-money laundering, IT security, fraud prevention, risk management and internal audit. In order to achieve these ambitious goals, I'm gonna be joined by my colleagues who are not just the best in what they do, but they also have inspiring personalities that help them through their journey of their professional lives. My today's guest is Ian Ross. Ian has 30 years of experience in compliance management and financial crime investigation and prevention. A former UK police officer, now established in key international sectors, supporting governments, regulators, and international law enforcement. He has advised on several international fraud and corruption investigation cases. In 2021, Ian was appointed as a listed expert to the International Criminal Court of Justice in The Hague. He is a fellow of the Chartered Management Institute and an accredited counter-fraud specialist, a trainer for the Association of Certified Anti-Money Laundering Specialists, and an active trainer in investigative interviewing. Overall has delivered over 1,000 hours of professional training. Ian holds a PhD in international law and a master's degree in counter-fraud and corruption studies. He is a published author of 3 books. Hello Ian, welcome to the Defense Lines. Thank you for accepting my invitation.
Hello and thank you for having me.
The world of shady politicians, lawyers, bankers, accountants, drug dealers or any other criminals is not the most beautiful thing on earth. What was the reason for you to take a deep dive into this topic?
Well, unlike other people, some people want to be doctors, some people want to fly aeroplanes. It wasn't quite the same for me, to be honest with you. I didn't become a fraud investigator all those years ago because I had in mind some kind of great crusade of ridding the world of crime. I think it's fair to say that my way into this was that I always had very good problem-solving ability, without sounding too boastful. And I carried this forward. I had it from a young age. And later on, I thought it might be a very good thing to apply this in criminal scenarios. So as a young police officer, I joined. And as my career took shape, to be honest with you, the deep dive then really happened for me in terms of seeing how much fraud was going on in the world. I was very surprised by it. And then also taking a further deep dive when I left the force, given the fact getting into these areas where fraud, corruption, money laundering was happening in places you would never even dream of, certainly not to the extent that it does. So it's really been a bit of a journey for me with certain signposts along the way. But I think what really took me into this vocation, if you like, is a kind of bedrock, personally, of problem-solving ability taken into these areas which are extremely challenging and rewarding for me as a professional.
Was it like a moral call as well?
I think so, yeah. I think you've got to have some kind of moral compass to make sure that you're on the right way. I mean, the most intelligent people make the most intelligent criminals who make those kind of choices. So, yeah, I think the short answer to that, without sounding kind of too sanctimonious, is very much so. I consider myself as a kind of an upright moral person. I don't say I don't have my faults, but I'm simply saying that my kind of drive professionally has always been to go along, do the right thing, call out the badness, which is what I do, and take it from there, really. Because at the times when you have your moral compass, this is not just about staying on the fence and being diplomatic and all sugary about things all the time. It's more about being realistic, I think. And even though at times you will fall foul, like you say, I think the best way to answer that is to do the right thing when no one else is looking.
Exactly. We can read about bigger and bigger fines and penalties because of AML breaches. The news is always about the financial institutions and in some cases about the employees of the banks. These fines are, of course, important. It is a proper tool, or it can be a proper tool in the supervisor's hand, but to serve the society's sense of justice, the criminals whose ill-gotten gains were laundered in the first place must be jailed. When will we get more information about those people? Or are they too big to fail?
Well, I don't think they're too big to fail, but certainly they are too big mostly to be held accountable legally. I've been saying for years that fining banks and whoever else is subject to compliance-dominant legislation is really not achieving a great deal. You fine a bank, so who pays the fine?
The client.
Well, I'm glad you said that. But at the end of the day, the customer pays the fines. And it's miraculous, isn't it? Once the bank is fined by a regulator, that's it done with. There is no kind of control, if you like, about how this fine then is actually paid or levied back to the regulator. So, for example, it is so incredible, isn't it? And so marvelously kind of incidental and coincidental, I should say, given the fact that once a bank is fined, then the bank charges for customers kind of double in an instant. And I have proof of this. It's happened to me. One of my bank accounts is held by a very famous bank who were caught and fined for anti-money laundering breaches. The next thing, we're all getting letters telling that changes to your rates. I've never seen anything as preposterous and quite insulting. And they give a load of blurb and nonsense in the letter about why it has to be. At the end of it all, they've just been hit by so millions of euros of fines for their criminality, basically, and we pay for it. No one actually controls this. Once the regulator fines the bank, they simply wash their hands of it. I mean, what kind of punishment is that? Yeah. I've said all along for years that fining banks really has become just an exercise. Who goes to jail? No one. Who pays the fine? The customer. It's as simple as that, really.
It's really like it is the cost of business, these fines.
Well, it is, exactly so. Basically, as far as I am concerned, and many others, not just me, when a bank is fined, it's simply a case of sharing a slice of the profits. Mm-hmm. No one goes to jail and no one gets individual liability. We had some kind of tentative move in the UK last year when NatWest were prosecuted under criminal procedure. But at the end of the day, they went to court, they were found guilty, but this was just regulation wearing a different jacket, basically, because they were fined. They were not at all. There was no individual liability at all. It was just the same kind of process. Bank is fined, and who pays the fine? We go back to the same question, which I think we know the answer to by now.
When we talk about money laundering or any kind of financial crime, we can't neglect the fact that many corrupt politicians are involved. Politicians who are in charge, politicians who are responsible for setting the right legal framework. This causes a huge conflict of interest. How can we solve this issue?
Well, first of all, we need to be clear about the dilemma about what corruption actually means in these kind of contexts. I mean that politicians are targeted in many ways, unfairly, I think, but at the same time, they have themselves to blame, given the fact also that there are instances, of course, around the world, you name it, there's been a corrupt politician. But it's really not a difficult area, but it's a kind of discussion area that will never, ever be resolved. I'll give you an example of this, and I'm using the word corruption very politely and neutrally here. Look at this horrible case of the post office scandal in the UK. In a nutshell, we had 736 prosecutions brought by the post office who falsely and maliciously accused postmasters of fraud and false accounting. Now, this case has been going on now since 2000, something like it. Been a very, very long time. And over a 14-year period, these prosecutions were brought. Innocent people went to prison. Nobody had committed any crime at all among these people. And the cases are all being heard on appeal and overturned. Convictions quashed, rightly so. But it's taking forever. And the problem is you have with this, that this isn't just a legal problem, it's a very strong political one as well. Because this minister, if you like, called Paul Scully of the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, there's no question at all up until now that this man has simply sided with his post office executive. No question. Well, what we had was, when the leader, Mr. Bates, took the post office to court, he sued the post office over all this. He said enough is enough. And then they went to the High Court in London and they won their case, decided in 2018. But then the practical problem is of deciding and finalizing compensation for all the horrible, unbelievable, inhumane, and I'm not being melodramatic here, treatment and what they put these poor people through it's appalling, the way that it was kind of squirming around politically, delay tactics and everything else. Mr. Scully has been quoted on many occasions before now as saying, oh, that was a full and final settlement or full and final agreement offer a compensation. What that related to was what they call the historical shortfall scheme. Basically, 555 of those postmasters, they took a kind of a class action to the High Court. When they won this, then the Post Office then decided to put a compensation scheme forward, but it had severe limitations on it. All of those people who took part, if you like, parties to the case, who won the High Court case, were completely excluded and barred from this compensation scheme. I mean, if that isn't political, I don't know what is. And at the end of the day, you had a prominent member of government in the middle of this who kept repeating the narrative from the Post Office executive. The words full and final, with the door then slamming straight after it. But now we have this statutory inquiry into the whole scandal itself. And now Mr. Scully is saying, oh yes, we should be looking at full and fair compensation. Well, he's only saying that now because we have a statutory inquiry. Before, he simply didn't want to know. In other words, we have a politician and others obviously around him. There is a very strong link between this and the way these prosecutions were brought. Unfortunately, he says one thing now, and he's still not done anything about his promises he made months ago. So what he does, in fact, is say one thing to the postmasters, but when he gets with the Post Office executive, he sings a very different song. And it really is. You take a more practical example. Well, politicians introduce new laws into Parliament. I'm sure they do the same in Hungary as well. And yet they're the first ones to break them some of the time. We could talk a whole long time and a great list of examples of this. But I think at the end of the day, when you get kind of absolutely clear examples of law breaking, offset against the kind of unethical behaviors, again, this is where the kind of grey area is. At the end of it all, let's put it politely, politicians are humans. They don't deserve abuse. We had 2 politicians in the UK murdered in the last few years by 2 racist lunatics. That is not what we're condoning at all, not in the least. At the end of it all, politicians are not corrupt because they are politicians. Politicians are corrupt because they choose to be corrupt. And in my kind of experience over the years of looking into causation and everything of fraud and corruption and everything else, the most skilled, if you like, of fraudsters and criminals, whether they are politicians or anyone else, have this very slick skills in being able to work the systems and the policies and situations that are around them. That's how they do it. It's not because they are born criminals. It's not because politicians walk around with labels on their heads saying I'm corrupt. It's because they choose to be so at certain times and enrich themselves. Again, how many hundreds of proven cases are there of this? But this is the way it is. Certainly political influence has a drive in problems in one form or another.
I think we cannot avoid the topic of the war in Ukraine and the necessity that Russia must be stopped somehow. I usually read in mainstream media that Hungary is too close to Russia, which is true in my opinion, and to be honest, I don't like this fact. But let's face the music, we are highly dependent on Russian oil and gas, so pragmatically we should have some business relationship with them. But how about the developed western part of Europe? How about United Kingdom? How about London itself? Correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, London is, or hopefully just was, the paradise for Russian oligarchs to launder their ill-gotten gains.
Well, Andras, there is a saying that good intentions can lead to bad decisions, and this has been proven the case. I mean, at the end of it all, Vladimir Putin has done what he has done, and something has to be done about that and him. But as far as dealing with this is concerned, yeah, I mean, the problem you've got now with the sanctions, for example, I mean, to be honest with you, what they're doing, that we're already seeing U-turns, aren't we, with sanctions? This is the problem. This is not to be taken to mean that nothing else should be done. But, frankly, you have someone sat behind a desk in Brussels who decides that they want to pass a a sanction to stop the importation to EU of Russian oil. Now, Malta, for example, recently objected to this, and a couple of other countries, I understand. As a consequence of these objections, the EU have lifted the sanction. You see, this is what's happened when the good intention led to this kind of embarrassing U-turn. Some of the, going to your point of call, if you like, to London, yeah, again, over these years since 2011, everything else, Conservative Party were quite happy to avert their eyes from millions of pounds going into the country. Some of it coming into the Conservative Party as donorships. Not a single word was said. Theresa May, who was spectacularly useless as both Prime Minister and Home Secretary, never stirred a finger about it. It took the poisonings at Salisbury for anything to be done at all. And the best we got then from the Prime Minister was to say how the whole House condemns this action. But then the money still kept coming in. So it's okay to say one thing in Parliament, but then to keep taking oligarch money the next day, which is exactly what happened. And then, as they say, everything else, now that Ukraine has happened, sanctions have to be in some way or another. But I come back to this point that who's thinking these through? Some of the sanctions, certainly passed by the UK, are needed and are viable, but some of them are simply ludicrous. One of these is the continuation of these unexplained wealth orders. So far, they've been enhanced. Why on earth is that? So far, they proved to be wholly ineffective, other than in political brownie points, scoring against people who've had no evidence of money laundering against them at all. And now we're going to follow more. We were promised 10 of these orders every year. Since they came in 2018, we've had 4, not one of them against the Russians so far. And now we want more of the same failings. These are the kind of examples I just want to pick out, because these are important things. Why should we keep throwing resources at meaningless causes? Why is the EU Parliament keep getting wave after wave after wave of sanctions and simply hoping that some of them will work? Because many of them won't. And I think the fact that you made a very good example of this with your situation at Hungary, I sincerely hope that the pragmatic approach takes over the reason, because I don't want to see you guys freezing to death in the wintertime. Not in the least, no. And it's the same with the other kinds of situations here. Countries are objecting to these blanket gung-ho use of sanctions. So I think there's an awful lot to be reviewed concerning sanctions.
I think financial institutions face a huge gap in technological tools for the fight against money laundering. The tool that can evolve anti-money laundering activities is artificial intelligence. This humankind logic interface can change the entire role and structure of an AML department. Can the usage of artificial intelligence be the holy grail in the fight against money laundering? How can we use this new tool during our work? Is this our future, or is it just a dead end?
Holy Grail, I like that, thank you. I'm not making sort of light of that. I think you're right. I think it is. We simply cannot do without this now. If we were having this conversation, say, 10 years ago, I really wouldn't know too much of what you were saying. In my kind of experience in the kind of prevention and risk management, if you like, the AI has come into huge prominence. And in all honesty, there is no going back, and for very good reasons. At the end of the day, look at the kind of way that things have gone digital, for one thing. Maybe, I understand, 3 out of 5 people are doing their banking with their phones and their apps and everything else. And at the same time, there has to be automation. Gone are the days when you get groups of people sat in an office with massive trays of papers and sifting through intelligence and all the rest of it. There has to be a degree of automation, or better put yet, would be kind of process electronically, technologically. But let me put the brakes on the point there. Let me pause to say that remember that money laundering is still a human crime. Criminals will leverage technology to actually take advantage of human fallibility. And all the systems in the world doesn't change that. So really, to put a perspective on your question, I was in Seoul in Korea. I was actually presenting at a conference there, and I met with one of the other speakers, a senior professor of one of the data institutes there, who spends a lot of time at Silicon Valley. Now, these are the kind of people who should be going to and reconciling the law, the experts, the courts, understanding it, because what we don't want is suddenly this great loss, this great horrible space, black hole of information and evidence going into it. Because what happens is, if all the money laundering, and it's more out of control than ever before, because we've got more armies of lawyers, armies of compliance managers, armies of risk managers, but the problem doesn't get any less, does it? And with AI coming into it more than ever, we need to pull these things together. There's been too much of this, we're the police, you're the banks, you're somebody else. There's been an odd, I accept, strategic partnership initiative taking place. But how long do they last? Yeah, you might get a once a year talking shop, forgive my bluntness, in some place, and then the whole thing just falls over. It just doesn't happen. There has to be a systematic thoroughness, consistency, sticking with the job. Going to this gentleman that I had a fascinating conversation with in the coffee break, who is able to reconcile issues of crime with automation. There is some point to it, but we've got to get away from this one extreme to another, relying on solutions and processes which are coded by people, frankly, who don't even know what money laundering is. And this is it. And we need more input, we need more consistency and thoroughness into this. And at the end of the day, there is no single international criminal court in the world that has jurisdiction over every country in the world. So this is a legal problem and dilemma that's not going to change anytime soon. So yes, the holy grail of automation and expertise really should come back, and certain organizations are around to give advice. The Financial Action Task Force, who produce some very quality advice and guidance, if you like. But they're guidance people. They're not law enforcement, and I'm not being disparaging of them for a moment. There has to be, they produce some very good information, and they have a lot of experts working for them, but this kind of reconciliation has to take place. And then, I'll give you a brief example and extract something from it. So if we're going to have the COVID-19, you can ask yourself after the pandemic, well, what next in terms of stopping money laundering? Yeah, we're getting more to the point now. Digital is happening more and more and more and more. And I understand the need. I don't think to myself, yes, I've been doing this 30-something years, which is obviously I have. But I always look at the way things are going and where they're going. So, for example, with a KYC, Know Your Customer process happening, this will uplift. So now we need this kind of application programming interfaces more and more and more. But they have to be informed. They call them APIs, if you like. But they have to be more managed, and we've got to get away from this, I better put, within banks and within other regulated industries where they will deal with suspicious transactions and report them. We need better management in simply saying, oh, let's report everything and get ourselves some good figures of reporting everything to the National Crime Agency or to the regulator. That is a completely reverse effect. It just takes away any efficiency. It might look good for PR purposes, but it's no good at addressing the problem. Management of the problem, management of AI and process needs to be brought forward instead of just indulging and generating endless false positives, which is all it does at the end of it. But I don't think I'm being too idealistic, I should say. I think it's the holy grail. I think it's a good way of saying it. But I think also that the management of it and a lot more togetherness is needed to make it happen.
Ian, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining me today. You have just listened to The Defense Lines, the podcast for the control functions. If you found value in this episode, please subscribe so you will never miss a show. András Bácsfalvi is signing off, but till our next meeting, do not forget, those who try to convince you that safety can be increased only by jeopardizing your business goals will eventually deprive you of both.